Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 28 cheat sheet, and we'll be talking about what your chip strategy is and how that will impact some of the decisions that you have to make this week. What I will say is if you have things like the free hit, that will completely change some of the way you actually view some of the assets on the cheat sheet, because you'll have to be thinking about when you plan on free hitting and whether that impacts your actual plan of bringing in a player. So for example, let's say if I bring in someone like Madison this week, and I plan on free hitting on 32, I'll need to think about his fixture in 32 and probably just discount it from how long I want to own Madison for and what that impact of owning Madison will be for the rest of the fixture period. So with the midfielders, let's actually start off with Almiron. He gets a rise this week, and ironically, he actually got benched for this Wolves fixture, but he was also the player who saved the game. So he actually came on as a substitute and was able to score. He was also very, very close to assisting. And some people have mentioned that Wolves incorporated a tactical change once they actually started drawing versus Newcastle. So arguably, Almiron benefited from that tactical adjustment, but I would say that his performance was electric when he came on as a substitute, and that was the most endearing thing to why I've also risen him as an option. I just think that he is superior to someone like a Jacob Murphy on the right-hand side, and I think he'll continue to get some starts now that he's been benched one fixture and has shown pretty much and proved to Eddie Howe as well why he deserves to continue starting. As far as the actual fixtures, we know that Newcastle have many great fixtures coming, particularly Game Week 31, where they could actually have a double Game Week fixture. The interesting thing about Newcastle too is that with the assets where we probably go for triple Newcastle defense, Almiron gives you an option to move away from that and to go for a triple up of Newcastle that's a little bit different from the hybrid that we can continue to see on Twitter and other social media. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Isak, of course, will be an option that I'll talk about in the forward position, but as I said, Almiron is rising up. As far as Utara and Billing, these are two options that are interesting in that Bournemouth have fantastic four fixture runs, right? So Aston Villa, Fulham, Brighton, Leicester. Now Brighton, of course, is a tough fixture, and the rest of those fixtures are pretty good from a attacking point of view. We've already seen that this Bournemouth team could score versus Liverpool and Arsenal. Now Liverpool potentially you disagree whether they're actually easy to score versus, but the reality is that Bournemouth have looked a little bit better from the attacking point of view, and part of that too is because options like Billing and Utara are showing themselves out, and Solanke will be joining them as well. What I don't really like is that the midfield position already feels incredibly entrenched. You have so many assets from Arsenal and Brighton and United to think about, even Madison, for example, where it makes it extremely hard to actually get a fifth differential midfielder. Gibbs White is also another great option, particularly for Game Week 29. I don't love the fixture in Game Week 28, so he's more of a transfer to think about in Game Week 29, but I also find it incredibly hard to actually fit him into a team that makes sense when you have such great cheap options, and that's simply why you can see Mitoma, March, and McAllister standing strong at the top there as the kind of triplet of Brighton midfielders. And I really think, as I've said time and time again, it's really hard to pick wrong between these players. There's going to be weeks where March will get 12 points. There's going to be weeks where Mitoma will get 12, and the rest will blank, and so on and so forth. But this week we were quite fortunate that all of them had similar points, but that's not always going to stay the same as we saw in the previous week. As far as the 6.0 and the 7.0 sort of tiers of assets, no changes there. And with Saka, the interesting thing in that 8.0 to 8.9 tier is Saka could be one of those options that you could maybe think about going out of. Now that Saka seems to be very, very tired, he has to deal with maybe still European competition. I'm actually recording right now as the Sporting game is going on, with that sort of extra time fixture with Arsenal, with Sporting scoring a fantastic goal. But look, Madison is going to be another option to think about too. But I do think that this is the time now where you can consider taking Saka out of your team, going into an option like Fernandes, particularly if that allows you to have a stronger team structure for the next few weeks. So for all of us who have options like Saka plus Martinelli or Saka plus Odegaard, you could think about going out of Saka first. I know we're losing penalties here by taking Saka out of our teams, but if your transfer value allows you to go for Fernandes and Haaland with no issues, and Saka is the one that needs to go because you need a little bit more transfer value, that's fine. I still think you can drop him. And Odegaard, of course, he's the cheaper option and probably the option I would like to drop ahead of Saka. But if you can't do that, then I still find them as very, very similar assets to actually let go of, particularly in Game Week 29. If you wanted to go, let's say, into a Madison or a Fernandes or another Brighton midfielder, if you don't have one or two of them already. As far as the 9.0 assets, Fernandes is the one who rises. Now, this is ironic, of course, because of the blank in Gaming 28, but it just shows that the Gaming 29 and Gaming 30 is around the corner, where you just have these instant doubles after a blank, which we don't often see. But this is a great time and a great fixture run to own Fernandes. Yes, of course, people will be talking about his positioning in recent games, and of course, we haven't seen such crazy hauls from Fernandes, but this is a double game week fixture, and simply put, game week 30 and 31 are also very, very good on paper for Fernandes. We've talked about how Fernandes might change his positioning based on the Casemiro suspension, but I feel like I've seen enough games where Casemiro has been suspended, where Fernandes has been occupying good attacking positions, that I'm not too fearful of what his ceiling could be. The concern, of course, is just where he actually is positioned generally as a default position on the pitch. So if he plays further back, as we have seen as of late, then maybe actually Fernandes is not the priority transfer that we want to think about, and maybe Maddison instead will actually take priority over him. And that's kind of my consideration heading towards game week 29, particularly because it's a similar trajectory with even if Maddison is slightly unfit for game week 28. As far as Salah, he just doesn't get to rise because of the blank, and those fixtures are very tough. Now, Salah has had an imperious record versus some big teams, and he's probably one of the best premium assets in terms of performances versus big teams. But the concern for me is still how tough these fixtures are and how much money it costs to own Salah versus, let's say, Kane right now, where Kane has equally amount of fixtures, and I still prefer Kane over this fixture run to go over Salah. As far as Son and Sterling, these are options that you want to think about as differentials. Son is more of a free hit option for this week, but if Son continues to actually find his form, then we might actually find our ways towards pivoting back to Son sometime this season. I don't know if that's actually going to be the case. He costs a lot of money, and that's one of the problems with Son this season. But if he's in form, then he's going to be 100% an option that we think about. Sterling is hard to think about because of the lack of minutes. He hasn't really built enough, I would say, fitness to actually consistently play 90 minutes. And that just might be a Potter thing as well, where because he has so many options at the bench, Sterling is never going to be a 90-minute player right now, based on the circumstances that Chelsea find themselves in. If we go towards the forwards this week, Solanke is someone who rises towards the top in the budget area. I've separated the 4.5 to 5.9 assets and the 6.0 to 6.9 assets, so that's why you can also see a lot of changes there. Ferguson and Johnson do both fall. Johnson, it seems like, because he won't be able to meet the demands of making game week 28 on time, so therefore he will be rested. And it's arguably a good thing, right? Because game week 29 is the fixture that you really want Johnson in if for whatever reason you're waiting to get Johnson in your team. But still probably someone I would avoid for now, and not someone that I would be fussed to make a transfer for. On the other hand, Solanke is someone who actually has a good run of 4 fixtures. We talked about the Bournemouth assets in the midfield previously, and he's on penalty. So that's going to be a huge plus for someone like Solanke, who should be able to actually find himself towards a few goal tallies and goal contributions, given that they're easier fixtures compared to Arsenal Liverpool, where they also found it quite easy to score, to be quite honest. As far as Ferguson, because of the benching over Welbeck in the previous game versus Crystal Palace, I just can't see how you would ever go Ferguson over another Brighton defender. I previously said that I prefer 2 Brighton midfielders and frankly all Brighton midfielders over Ferguson last week, but I thought Ferguson could be an interesting option to go for over one of the defenders. But I have sort of backtracked on that opinion. I have to admit that Ferguson just doesn't seem that appealing because the minutes are very low. It was the concern that we had last week, and frankly, I would think about going out of Ferguson, maybe actually saving that Brighton spot for someone like Steele, who actually looked very good, and I think he'll continue to play for De Zerbi, or just go for the much more safer option, which I think is going to be Estupiñán. A lot has been said about Estupiñán, but I'll talk about that later in the defender section. As far as Iheanacho, he falls because the concern is now that Daka is finding some more minutes in the side, which previously wasn't the case. We only saw kind of very late Vardy substitutions, even Vardy substitutions where Iheanacho would stay on the field with him. But with Daka finding his way back to getting some more minutes, I'm very worried about Iheanacho and the ceiling of him as an asset. So that's my concern there, particularly given that he's sort of entered a run of poor finishing. As far as Isak, he's the opposite almost of Iheanacho, but you could also argue that he is the Iheanacho 3 weeks ago, where Iheanacho was an exceptional option, had good stats, looked good on the eye test, and was someone who was getting a lot of good consistent chances. Now, that was the case versus Wolves, and we've seen Isak in very small little moments this season, such as the beautiful debut versus Liverpool, and he has nuggets as a player. And I think the interesting thing is whether we can actually take that punt to go towards Isak this week and whether it would be worthwhile. In my opinion, it's actually not. Maybe he'll actually be a crazy punt, but you have to also think about whether he'll actually get penalties. He probably will take penalties for this Newcastle team because he took the last penalty when Wilson was off the pitch. But my concern is just minutes and whether he'll actually continue to get consistent starts. And I feel like until we get to see maybe 2 or 3 games in a row where Isak is continuously starting over Wilson, getting consistently more minutes week on week, I don't think I can push him towards a green option immediately. As far as Brentford and Aston Villa, those are 2 fixtures where, look, Newcastle are going to probably have a double around game week 31, so this run in general for Newcastle is fantastic. So when you're looking at going for a Newcastle asset, there's no wrong decision, I would say, to actually go for any sort of random triple up of Newcastle. Ultimately, if you have 2 defenders plus one of the attackers, I think you'll actually be really relatively well set up. So it's not like Isak is a major risk. I would probably prefer him less towards Havertz and Watkins, who you can see clearly in the tier next to that. So Havertz and Watkins are going to be priority transfers for all of us managers this week who are looking to actually go out of Erling Haaland to maybe allow us to get a team of 10, a team of 11, maybe even a team of 9. So the reason why Havertz and Watkins are so interesting is because we talked about how Havertz is starting to get much more interesting underlying stats with the tactical change that Chelsea have incorporated by moving into a back 3. Havertz is someone who's now dropping deeper a little bit, but we're also seeing him become the clear focal point. In previous matches, when they were playing a back 4 in different structures, we saw Felix actually get a lot of chances, but now you're entering a situation where Havertz is probably on penalties. He's the focal point. He gets much more shots than some of his peers, and he can also be someone who's very good at link-up play. That's something that Havertz was actually relatively well known for in the Bundesliga. But he has been a little bit dismaying from the sort of finishing point of view, and I can understand why people want to prefer going for Watkins, who also is on penalties, has better underlying stats. However, of course, note that Havertz is sort of undergoing a change in role, but Watkins similarly underwent a change in manager, someone who is actually allowing this Aston Villa team to actually consistently build more chances compared to the days of Gerrard. So that's why I feel like both of them are great options. I would prefer Watkins still a little bit more, but do keep in mind that Havertz has 3 home fixtures. The interesting thing about Havertz is you also might have to weigh up between assets like Reece James and Chilwell and how many Chelsea assets you truly want to go for. So that's one thing that makes Havertz a little bit more tough. Whereas with Watkins, I think he is a priority transfer if you wanted to go for an Aston Villa assets that really have no issues from a fixture point of view. As far as Tony, he does drop for me. My concern with Tony is simply, first of all, 9 yellow cards. So therefore he is 1 yellow card away from getting suspended for 2 matches. And then we also have the anticipated date of the hearing to be somewhere in April, which would mean that with the international break coupled with that Tony will probably find his way to playing much less football than imagined over this game week 28 to game week 31 period. So it almost feels like the end of the bittersweet story for Tony. I haven't owned him for too long, but he was exceptional last week for me as a captain, and I was happy to own him, but now I think it's time for him to drop into the yellow tier. As far as Jesus, he does join the cheat sheet, and the reality is I don't think Jesus is a priority transfer anytime soon until maybe game week 32 or even 31 versus West Ham. Those are the times where I would probably think that Jesus will find his way towards being a 90-minute man, and that's my expectation for going for Jesus. As far as Felix, we've talked about him and why he's moved away from Havertz. Havertz has sort of just continuously moved further away because Felix is now getting much less minutes and being less of a 90-minute player compared to someone like Havertz, who's actually been nailed for the time being. And Darwin, we were talking about how Haaland, who's such an exceptional asset with such a high ceiling, could be a transfer out this week. So for that same reason, I mean, Darwin, who's a much worse asset, has to fall. And Kane, for me, becomes actually the best forward in the game. As far as the defenders, we move on over there. Duncan and Estupinian fall, and you can clearly see that there is a common theme here within the defenders cheat sheet. It's actually going to be the fact that Newcastle assets are almost essential, right? I think going double Newcastle defense, whether it's a keeper plus a defender pairing, let's say Trippier and Pope, or Trippier plus Burn, Trippier plus Botman, these are all pairings that you'd want to go for because Newcastle have so many fixtures that we expect to have in the short term. And on top of that, they just don't have blank. So that's going to be a huge positive for going for Newcastle assets. They're also very, very cheap from the defensive point of view. So it does allow you to accommodate for going for the higher ceiling assets, such as a Brighton midfielder, such as an Arsenal midfielder as well. So that's why I've pushed all the Newcastle assets up towards the top. That's why you can see Schär included in the cheat sheet there. and Botman and Burn rising at the top of the budget ones. Duncan and Stupinian fall simply because I think they could be a transfer out this week, but they're also probably going to be a priority transfer out in the next week in Game Week 29. If you're one of the managers who didn't go for Steele last week, or you have the option to go for a third Brighton player, I actually think that holding a transfer towards Duncan Estupinian, particularly Estupinian, is going to be an exceptional move. A lot has been said about the short turnaround time with him in Game Week 29 when he plays this international friendly game, but I still think that, but with how essential he seems to be with this Brighton team on the ball, I would have to say Stupinian is not a threat at all to rotation in Game Week 29. Mitoma is equally under threat of rotation, so I feel like the same argument can be held for him, but we're not going to change Mitoma from our teams, are we? So Stupinian for me is someone who I think will stay. As far as Mings, he's a great option, and Moreno, Alex Moreno particularly, could be an interesting option. I just think that he's a little bit too much of a punt for me to go for a player who actually doesn't necessarily have the best double game week 29 fixtures, particularly from the clean sheets point of view. It's a set of fixtures where I feel like I'd be much more interested in owning Watkins, and then for that reason, as I said previously, Watkins is the asset that I would like to go for and keep. But you can clearly see that this overall fixture run towards the end of the season for Aston Villa does possess a lot of good home game opportunities for them to keep a clean sheet. So Alex Moreno is one to keep an eye on. Otherwise, Mings is going to be that sort of permanent option that you don't really have to frown upon. As far as other options, Pedro Porro does rise as a differential in the cheat sheet, or rather he's been introduced to the cheat sheet as a differential. I think he's a great free hit option, but I would probably be a little bit concerned about just the fact that he is blank compared to some of the other assets that probably have equally high ceilings and double game week fixtures. So that's my concern there. So look at Chilwell and Reece James as examples. Me, Pinnock, and Harry unfortunately fall because I feel like the Game Week 29 double is much, much worse than the Game Week 27 double. I'm not the type of manager who would say that Brentford were terrible away. In fact, that's exactly why I went for Brentford defense quite confidently. But I also do think that there is a bit of a swing here after Game Week 28 versus Leicester, where you can comfortably think about taking out even both your Brentford defenders in Game Week 29, particularly if you have, let's say, two outfield players such as a Me and a Henry who could be moved on to some of the more premium tier assets. And if we look at the 5.0 to 5.4 tier, that's why we can see someone like Shaw, who's kind of waiting on the wings to be a green tier asset next week. I think he's going to be a transfer that a lot of people will be thinking about bringing back into their teams in Game Week 29, but of course, nothing to think about this week. As far as Shar, we've discussed that previously. And at 5.5 plus, what I would like to say is James still has to rise as a top asset. I think he's clearly second to Chilwell and second to Trippier. But you have so many options now with 5 defenders and a lot of people looking towards playing a bench boost with a lot of money in the bank that James can be a viable option. However, as I've been saying all week long, you need to make sure that you have enough money to go for Erling Haaland in Game Week 29 or Game Week 30. Whatever transfers you plan to go for in the next few weeks, you need to make sure you have a route back to the Norwegian King. As far as the goalkeepers, just to round things out, we have some changes here in De Gea rising towards the top as an asset to think about. The reason why is because I feel like a lot of people will be wildcarding this week, so De Gea is an absolutely interesting option to go for if you're planning to bench boost on 29. Ramsdale falls because I just think the ceiling is much lower compared to the other Arsenal defenders. And then with Raya, he falls towards the same level as Steele. I actually think that Steele could end up being a green option next week, so that's kind of the change in trajectories of these two keepers, where if you look at Game Week 29, exceptional fixtures from Brighton to maybe keep a clean sheet there, potentially particularly in the Bournemouth game. So that's going to be the cheat sheet this week. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys very, very shortly.